What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another highly combustible reaction. We're gonna be jumping into something kind of cool. Vincent Van Gogh, the humble genius. I'm definitely looking forward to this. We have seen a couple things about, like, we've seen a couple of the songs, Vincent. We've also seen a couple things about other painters, but not necessarily him. If you guys enjoy the content as we go along, most certainly go show Biographics some love. We're already liked and subbed up for sure. It's coming at us from Fred. Much love. We already learned that we've been saying Vincent's name wrong our entire lives. But let's jump into it. Let's see what else we can learn about the man. Let's go.
So I want to head this off at the pass. In the UK, we pronounce this man as Vincent Van Gogh, not Vincent Van Gogh. I'm going with the British pronunciation throughout. Enjoy. Vincent van Gogh was one of the greatest artists of all time, but he just didn't know it. Despite his struggles with mental illness, he still produced some of the greatest work that anyone has ever seen. While we all know about his famous paintings, few people know the intimate details of the man's life. On today's Biographics, we're going to delve into the passionate life of Vincent van Gogh. It's impossible to live up to the dead, but this is how Vincent van Gogh began his life in a small village called Groot-Zundert in the Netherlands in 1853. His parents, Anna Cornelia Carbentus and Theodorus van Gogh, had a son who was stillborn, who they named Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. 1 year later, they had a second son and gave their new baby the same name. Growing up, Vincent would walk about with his mother and see his own name engraved on this dead brother's tombstone.
See, this should at least change the middle name or something. I don't know that I would name my stillborn. Don't think that I would name my newborn after my stillborn. I don't know if that I would want that look. Like, just that kind of energy on it. Very, very interesting. Definitely something we didn't know. We're learning something today. We're learning a few things today.
Her mother seemed to be traumatized by the death of her first child, and she was never afraid to tell the stories of how she lost him. In her mind, the real Vincent was this perfect little angel in heaven, and no one could possibly compare to him. Both his father and grandfather were ministers for the Dutch Reformed Church, so it was a very strict household to be raised in. Anna and Theodorus, they went on to have 2 more boys and 3 girls. Anna was most likely suffering from depression because she was never very loving or affectionate with any of her children. She never gave them love or praise, which made Vincent try his best to be deserving of the love he craved. Anna was an amateur artist, so she took her children into the fields and instructed them all to draw in their sketchbooks. Vincent loved to do this, and he would even carefully take bugs and plants home with him so that he could finish the drawing later. Vincent was forced to leave school at a very young age. They needed him to work as soon as possible.
Do you imagine how rough that would have been? To be not only named after your dead brother, but to never ever be able to fully be as, like, up there in mom's eyes. Whoa. That would mess your head up.
Luckily, his uncle was an art dealer at a firm called Gauguin & Cien. This was obviously the best kind of apprenticeship that Vincent van Gogh could have hoped for. He was surrounded by amazing works of art, and part of his job was visiting museums to learn about the other great masters. He taught himself to read and speak French, German, and English fluently so that he could sell art to clients all over Europe. His brother Theo was also made to work for the same art dealership. After completing his apprenticeship, Vincent was transferred to one of the branches of the dealership in London. When he was 20 years old, he moved into a boarding house owned by a widow named Sarah Ursula Lawyer. Her daughter, Eugenie, was 19 years old. Vincent wrote to his family that he was very happy in the Lawyer house. He wrote that he loved the hustle and bustle of London, and he did the gardening and other chores to help the ladies around the house. Now, this is where the story gets a little tricky. Historians tell the story in a few different ways, depending on the evidence that they find. Some believe Vincent fell in love with the daughter, Eugenie, since they were only a year apart. Others believe that he was actually in love with the mother, which would be far more scandalous. This has intrigued people for years, and there was even a play.
It would definitely be more scandalous
in Brixton, where they theorized that he fell in love with both of them. Either way, he proposed marriage to one of them, only to learn that they were engaged to other men. Vincent was shocked and tried to convince her to marry him instead. He began to argue, asking what was wrong with him. Their arguments were so intense that he was kicked out of the boarding house and told never to come back.
That's kind of shitty lurkerish to get kicked out.
From age 20 to 23, Vincent started to read the Bible every single day, and he put himself at a high standard of piety. Customers visiting the Gauguin and Cien gallery were told not to buy the artwork. Obviously, this is the exact opposite of what Vincent should have been doing at his job, so he was fired. He decided to follow in his father's footsteps and become a minister, and he found a job teaching at a Methodist school for boys. He applied to the School of Theology in Amsterdam. The school required everyone to pass Latin exams. If he did not study enough, he would punish himself by skipping meals or sleeping outside. Considering that he was almost fluent in several Latin-based languages, Vincent should have been able to pass the test quite easily. Vincent Van Gogh did not care so much about which church he belonged to. He just wanted to preach the Bible to the poor. So he went to the Evangelical Church of Belgium, and he was denied as well. In 1878, he approached the church and volunteered to go to the coal mining towns in Brussels, Belgium. Most ordained ministers did not want to go there because it was one of the poorest and dirtiest communities in the country. But these are the people that Van Gogh really wanted to help. While he lived there, he began to sketch the peasants while they were working in the coal mines. The church had given him a comfortable house to live in, but there was a local woman who was very sick and could no longer work. She could not afford to pay her rent and had become homeless. Vincent van Gogh took pity on her and gave the woman his house. He decided to go and live in one of the coal mining shacks instead.
He gave the woman his house and went and lived in a coal mining shack. That is not something I've learned from any stories that I've ever heard of this man. We're learning a hell of a lot today because that's something that they definitely skip over in anything you hear about him in any kind of American history class.
There was no furniture in the shack, and he was forced to sleep on the bare wooden floor with a blanket. The locals called him the Christ of the coal mines. Even though the common people loved him, the church committee was humiliated. They did not want someone who was living in squalor to represent their religion, so they decided to fire him. Without any real job skills to speak of, Vincent decided that the one thing he truly loved to do was paint. Instead of preaching about God and the passion he felt for the world, he painted his emotions instead. Now 27 years old, Vincent wrote a letter to his younger brother Theo, explaining that he wanted to become an artist. Theo was still working at the art dealership. He knew that Vincent was truly talented, and he encouraged him to pursue his dream. He even offered to financially support his endeavors to become an artist. They had an agreement that Theo would send Vincent 50 francs a month for his basic living expenses. Vincent would then send a number of paintings to Theo, who was allowed to keep any profits he may have made from selling his brother's paintings in the gallery. He was incredibly grateful for the opportunity and would forego eating meals in favor of buying more painting canvases. Back then, no one really knew the dangers of lead paint, so he would use his mouth to wet his paintbrush, which would have contributed to serious health issues. Even though he resolved to becoming a painter,
you don't want to be sucking on a leady paintbrush, that's for sure.
Vincent still had to push through his depression and his self-doubt. He once wrote, "If you hear a voice within you said, 'I cannot paint,' then by all means, paint, and that voice will be silenced." That same year, Vincent fell in love with the wrong person for a second time. His older first cousin, named Kivos Stricker, had just lost her husband and was still mourning his death. Vincent proclaimed his love and proposed to marry her, promising to make her happy. Not surprisingly, Key left his home and fled to her parents' house in Amsterdam. But Vincent wouldn't take no for an answer, and he followed her there. Vincent.
What did we say about the shady lurkings? That's twice now.
Confronted his aunt and uncle, begging to speak with Key because he thought that he could still convince her to become his wife. He claims that he didn't need long to accomplish this and put his hand over the gas flame, saying that he promised he would stop talking when he couldn't stand the burning of his flesh anymore. They quickly blew out the flame and told him to leave. Vincent moved to The Hague.
Nowadays, you might have got arrested. Nowadays, you might have went to jail for some kind of creepiness, for sure. Especially you start burning yourself or setting yourself on fire and doing now, holding your hand into a lit flame. Once you start hurting yourself, people gonna get involved. You might get issued a special white jacket with some extra long arms.
Which was the centre of the Dutch art movement at the time. At age 28, he completed his first oil painting and sent it to Theo. While living there, he met a prostitute named Clisina Maria Hornig, who was also called Cien. She was an alcoholic, suffering from syphilis and raising a 4-year-old daughter. Cien was also pregnant with another man's child when she met Vincent, so she could not work as a lady of the night. Yet again, his heart went out to women who were suffering, and he fell in love with her. He wrote to his brother Theo that he enjoyed feeling like he was needed. So Theo agreed to increase his monthly stipend so Vincent could take care of her and the children financially. Cien began modelling for him as a subject in his drawings. In a way, this was very helpful because he could not afford to hire models. But no surprises here, he caught both syphilis and gonorrhea from her. The pain was so excruciating that he had to be hospitalised. While he was in hospital, Cien had no loyalty to Vincent. She went back to selling herself on the streets. Vincent Van
This man went through a hell of a time, didn't he? My God. Trying to help people out.
Gogh was already having issues with his mental health, but syphilis is known for causing madness. When Theo learned about this scandal, he threatened to cut off Vincent financially if he did not end his relationship. He knew that Vincent had a huge heart and that he was being taken advantage of, so he was forced to break up with her and he left The Hague. In 1885, Vincent van Gogh painted a piece called The Potato Eaters when he was 33 years old. Today, it's considered one of his first masterpieces because it truly captures the emotions of these farm workers, and he had successfully captured the essence of the poor. He had hoped that his brother would be able to sell it because it was similar to the dark paintings done by the Dutch masters. However, it was not a popular style in Paris, which is where Theo was living and selling the work. They would send letters back and forth, with Theo sketching out examples of Monet because their work was actually selling very well. Vincent van Gogh had never heard of him, but he was intrigued to see the work. Once he arrived in Paris, Theo brought him to the art gallery so that he could see all the work that he had mentioned in the letters. Vincent was blown away by the beautiful Impressionist art movement. Vincent immediately understood why the style was so popular, and he swapped out his dark hues for vibrant colours. Theo also introduced him to various painters that are famous today. Hiring a model was
That's very cool to learn that he was inspired by other painters like Monet and people that were doing things a little bit differently along with the times. Maybe the times had changed a little bit and he was like, whoa, all right, I got to get on this new way. I got to start making some brighter colors. That's very cool knowledge to have. What's one of the things you always ask in an interview? Who are your inspirations? It's good to know who his inspirations are.
Very expensive, so he and his friends would pose for one another so that they could practice. This is why there are so many self-portraits of Vincent van Gogh. He often had no one else to model for him, so he had to look in the mirror. His postman, Joseph Rouland, often agreed to sit and have his portrait painted too, getting into long discussions with Van Gogh. Most of the Impressionists would only paint on days when the weather was beautiful. They cared a lot about finding the perfect light. They also understood the market really well, so they could sell their paintings and make enough money to live for months at a time. They would party and wait for inspiration to strike. Vincent van Gogh was the polar opposite. He had a very strong work ethic, and he was willing to paint every single day in order to get better at his craft. This caused him to get into a lot of debates because he believed that none of the other artists shared the same level of passion that he did. He once wrote, "I feel such a creative force in me. I am convinced that there will be a time when I will make something good every day on a regular basis. I am doing my very best to make every effort because I am longing so much to make beautiful things. But beautiful things mean painstaking work, disappointment, and perseverance."
Yes,
Theo
they do.
often had to apologize on behalf of Vincent's outbursts. The only artist in the group who actually felt inspired by Vincent's determination was Paul Gauguin. He encouraged Vincent to loosen up and encouraged him to start drinking a green liquor called absinthe. If you're unaware, absinthe can cause hallucinations.
Yeah,
and
it
would
can.
have only contributed to more problems in Vincent's mental health. Always determined to improve his style, he began studying Japanese art. It was almost as if he could see the soul behind the painter, so he felt determined to read books on Buddhist philosophy. He wished that he could move there and told the other Impressionists about it. Toulouse-Lautrec told him that the French countryside had a very similar look to Japanese countryside and encouraged him to move there instead. So he travelled to a town called Arles. It was truly beautiful and it motivated Vincent to paint even more than before. Once he arrived in Arles, Vincent found a yellow house with a very cheap rent of just 15 francs a month. He spent most days painting in isolation, surviving on a diet consisting mostly of cheap bread and coffee. At night, he would drink absinthe. There were points when he had absolutely no food, so he started to drink the turpentine paint thinner and eat paint. This began to do some serious damage to his nervous system, and his mental state was in rapid decline. Theo was worried about him and paid Gauguin a stipend to live and work with Vincent in Arles. When he found out that he was coming, Vincent filled up the house with sunflowers so that it was bright and cheerful for his best friend. He had been alone for so long, he stopped painting under the influence of the other Impressionist artists in Paris. Now the work was completely original. It was the best that it had ever been. At first, Paul and Vincent were getting along just fine as roommates, but since Vincent's mental state was disintegrating, he would initiate arguments with him, and things became very uncomfortable. Theo wrote a letter to Gauguin that a few of his paintings had been sold in Paris and sent him several hundred francs. During one particularly bad fight, Paul Gauguin left the yellow house with his luggage, announcing that he was taking the train back to Paris. As he was walking down the street of Arles, Gauguin heard footsteps running behind him. When he turned around, he saw Vincent Van Gogh holding an open razor blade. The two friends froze and stared at each other like deer caught in the headlights. In that moment, Vincent snapped out of it and realized the insanity of what he was doing. He turned around and ran away. Paul Gauguin hurried toward the train station and never spoke to Vincent again. A few hours later, Vincent showed up to the local brothel. The side of his face was bleeding. He handed one of the prostitutes an object, asking her to take good care of it. When the woman looked down in her open palm, she saw that he had handed her his own ear.
Yeah, you must certainly need to take care of that. Don't let that go anywhere.
The police showed up at Vincent's house the next day, and they took him to the hospital so that he could be treated for the open wound where an ear used to be. When his younger brother Theo arrived, Vincent was laying in bed, and he began having seizures. He was physically weak and completely delusional. Theo wrote a letter to their mother and sisters explaining that Vincent was very sick and that he might die. He wrote that he completely blamed himself for not coming to visit Vincent sooner to check on his well-being. After spending 2 weeks in the hospital, Vincent was released. He returned to his small yellow house and felt very much alone. Theo had waited until Vincent's recovery to tell him the news that he was engaged. Her name was Joanna Bonga. She was an accomplished piano player who gave public performances, and she worked at the British Museum Library. Theo and Joanna both shared a passion for the arts, and they were very happy together. Instead of being happy about the news, Vincent saw it as a sign that he would soon lose Theo's support, and there would come a day when he would no longer spend time with him. Gossip spreads like wildfire in a small town, so the citizens of Arles were whispering about the ear incident. They believed that Vincent Van Gogh was a threat to himself and others, so they signed a petition saying that they wanted him to
I would say he was
be
probably a threat to others for sure. After all of the previous stories we just heard, could get a little creepier, especially if you've been drinking absinthe, going a little mad.
locked in a cell in the hospital. He wrote a letter to his brother Theo, asking if he could be transferred to the Saint-Remy asylum, which would be a far more comfortable location than a cell. He also sent him 2 large crates full of his paintings, saying in a letter to Theo that he knew his life as a painter was probably never going to happen, and he hoped that he could become employed as a hospital orderly in the asylum, or any other job that he could possibly find. But Theo never gave up on Vincent's talent. He knew that the only thing that made his brother happy was painting, so he paid for 2 comfortable rooms side by side. One was used as his art studio, and the other to be used as his living quarters. The Saint-Remy convent and hospital had beautiful gardens, which is where Vincent would go to spend most of his time painting. He stayed sober and was fed 3 meals a day. His physical health was finally beginning to improve. Finally, after years of going unrecognized, Vincent Van Gogh received a letter from Theo saying that his paintings were going on display in an art show in Paris. One of the paintings, called The Red Vineyards, sold for 400 francs. This was the first time that anyone had ever paid money for one of his paintings, and it put a small dent into reimbursing Theo for the money he had invested for so many years. Vincent had been afraid that marriage would come between his relationship with Theo, but it was actually the opposite. Joanna understood and supported Vincent's art career as well. After Theo and Joanna got married and had their first son, Vincent came to visit. He had a gift for the baby, a painting called The Blossoming Almond Tree, which represented spring and new life. As he held his tiny nephew in his arms for the first time, they told him that the baby's name was Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. Overwhelmed by the honor, Vincent started crying tears of joy, and there truly was hope that things would get better.
Wow.
With all of Vincent's new hope and optimism about life, Theo believed that his brother's health may have been improving, so he helped him leave the asylum and find a place to live in the town of Auvers. He chose an apartment living above a doctor named Paul Gachet, who was an amateur painter and a huge supporter of the Impressionist movement. Theo hoped that by living with Dr. Gachet, he could live an independent life, but still be close to medical care whenever he needed. Dr. Gachet knew that Vincent had gonorrhea and syphilis, but he didn't know about his history of mental issues. For a while, things seemed to be fine. Vincent had dinner and pleasant conversations with Gachet's family and painted the portraits of his new friends and neighbors. On July the 27th, 1890, Vincent received a letter from Theo where he said that he was struggling selling paintings that month. He was simply venting and never said that he would stop helping Vincent financially. Theo even included the usual 50 francs, but even the mention of financial difficulties sent Vincent into a downward spiral of self-hatred. He felt he was a burden on the ones he loved the most and that they would be better off without him. Vincent found a loaded pistol and walked out into the middle of a field before shooting himself in the chest. Bleeding and in shock, Vincent realized that he was still alive. He had barely missed his heart. He slowly stumbled back to the house where Dr. Gachet began to operate immediately. The doctor sent a message for Theo to come on the next train. When he arrived, Theo found his brother sitting up in bed. Vincent was covered in bandages and smoking his pipe. Theo crawled into bed next to his brother, and they stayed up all night talking about the happy memories from their childhood. As they were falling asleep, Vincent said, "This is just like when we were home. Please take me home." Theo agreed to take him back to their little Dutch village as soon as he recovered. But it would never happen. Vincent died in his sleep at 37 years old. They covered his coffin in bright yellow sunflowers. Just 6 months later, Theo died as well because he had secretly been suffering from syphilis too. The brothers were buried side by side. Theo's widow, Joanna, was left with almost nothing except their young son and a huge collection of Vincent van Gogh's paintings. As she went through his crate of these so-called rejects, she found the Starry Night, which he had painted while looking out the window at the mental asylum. Vincent attached a letter explaining the painting. "Looking at the stars always makes me dream, as simply as I dream over the black dots representing towns and villages on a map. Just as we take a train to get to Tarascon or Rouen, we take a death to reach a star. We cannot get to a star while we are alive, any more than we can take the train when we are dead. To die quietly of old age would be to go there on foot." Joanna carefully catalogued Vincent's work. She also collected his letters, which is why we have so much information about the kind of person he was. Joanna began to go across the continent to all the places where Vincent had lived, trying to find any of his paintings so that she could keep track of them. Most people had written Vincent off as a madman, so they'd either destroyed the paintings or given them away. Joanna was able to catalogue over
Talk about those regrets, huh?
2,100 sketches and pieces of art, 860 of which were oil paintings. That does not include all the ones that were lost or destroyed. Vincent van Gogh's mother, Anna, was still rejecting him even after his death. She burned an entire crate of her son's work, but she lived long enough to witness just how wrong she was, and the entire world began to realize that he was truly a genius. With Joanna's help, the paintings finally began to sell, and his lifetime of prolific work supported his family for the rest of their lives.
Mama got some instant
Van Gogh's
karma.
work is truly worth a fortune, and the portrait of Dr. Gachet sold for $82.5 million. Even to this day, his paintings still fetch tens of millions of dollars. He is considered to be one of the greatest painters of all time. Despite all of his struggles, Vincent van Gogh spent his life with passion and was devoted to the things he loved. And even after attempting suicide, he still found a reason to live. It is good to love many things, for therein lies the true strength. And whosoever loves much performs much and can accomplish much. And what is done in love is done well. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. And don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos 4 days a week. So hit that notification bell when you're subscribing so you find out about those. Also, why not check out our sister channel, Biographics. And as always, thank you for watching.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Vincent Van Gogh, the humble genius. Woo, by Biographics. That damn near got us to tears there at the end. The man really did go through a lot, and then right then, never got to really see. We heard him say, "Hey, my painting career is never going to go anywhere." He never really got to see it go anywhere, but damn did it go somewhere. Everybody knows his name. Everybody wants his paintings. At that point, where else can you go? You definitely made it as a painter. Even if you were a little creepy at times, Vincent. If you guys enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you disliked it, hit the dislike button. Go show Biographics some love. Definitely check out their other channel, Geographics. I'll leave all of the descriptions. I'll leave all of the links down inside the description. Until the next one, I'm highly combustible. You guys be happy, healthy, safe. It'll be to the moon and back. Peace.